If they tear this garden down tomorrow, I think this town will forget how to smile again. I heard a little girl whisper those words as she held a paper lantern against her chest, her tiny hands shaking in the warm summer wind. Across the street, two bulldozers sat silent beneath the glow of orange streetlights, waiting for sunrise. Around me, hundreds of people stood shoulder to shoulder inside the garden that had once been nothing more than an abandoned patch of dirt in the middle of Seabrook Cove. Children clung to their parents. Elderly couples sat quietly on worn wooden benches wrapped in blankets. Strings of tiny lights swayed above rows of sunflowers and tomato vines while soft violin music drifted through the humid night air. Nobody wanted to leave. Nobody wanted to believe this could be the last night. And right in the center of it all sat Evelyn Harper, her silver hair glowing softly beneath the lantern light, her weathered hands resting in her lap as tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. 3 months earlier, almost nobody in town even knew her name. Back then, the garden looked like a forgotten wound in the middle of the old neighborhood. The grass had grown waist-high in some places. Rusted watering cans lay tipped over near broken flower beds. The wooden fence leaned sideways as if one strong wind could finally knock it down for good. People drove past it every day without looking twice. Most folks in Seabrook Cove had stopped talking to each other years ago anyway. The town still looked beautiful from far away with its white beach houses, fishing docks, and bright blue ocean stretching for miles. But underneath all that postcard charm, people had become strangers. Neighbors waved less. Front porches stayed empty. Families ate dinner in silence, while television screens filled the rooms with noise nobody really listened to. Then one July morning, just after sunrise, Evelyn Harper appeared. She arrived pushing an old metal gardening cart with one squeaky wheel that rattled against the sidewalk. She wore faded denim overalls, gardening gloves that had clearly been used for years, and a straw hat with a torn ribbon hanging from one side. Tucked beside a small shovel was an old cell phone connected to a portable speaker with cracked tape around the edges. Nobody knew where she came from. Nobody knew why she chose that garden. People only noticed that every morning after that, she returned. At exactly 7 o'clock, while most of the town still slept behind drawn curtains, Evelyn knelt beneath the summer heat, pulling weeds from the dry earth one handful at a time. Sometimes she paused to stretch her back, while the sound of calm storytelling drifted from her tiny speaker. "Welcome back to the warmest place," a gentle voice would say. Then stories about lonely strangers finding friendship or neighbors helping each other through difficult times floated softly across the empty garden. A few people watched from their windows. Others pretended not to notice her at all. Gerald Pike, who owned the grocery store across the street, snorted every time he saw her. "That woman's wasting her time," he muttered one afternoon while stacking soda crates outside his shop. "Nobody around here cares about a dead garden." Brenda Shaw from the burger stand next door agreed. "People barely talk to their own families anymore," she said while wiping down a counter. "Flowers won't fix that." But Evelyn never argued. She simply kept working. Day after day, weed after weed. One afternoon, Mason Cole rolled past on his bicycle, carrying a fishing pole over one shoulder. He slowed down when he saw Evelyn struggling to drag a pile of dry branches across the dirt. For a moment, he just watched her silently. Then, without saying a word, the 12-year-old dropped his bike onto the grass and started helping her stack the branches into neat bundles. Evelyn smiled at him, surprised. "You don't have to do that," she told him gently. Mason shrugged. "I wasn't doing anything important anyway." It was the first real conversation that garden had seen in years, and neither of them realized it then, but something had already started growing there long before the first seed ever touched the soil. The next morning, Mason returned with 2 bottles of cold lemonade tied inside the basket of his bicycle. The air already felt heavy with heat, even though it was barely past 8 o'clock, and the smell of salt from the ocean drifted through the sleepy streets of Seabrook Cove. Evelyn was kneeling beside what used to be an old flower bed, carefully loosening dry soil with a hand rake, while the familiar sound of the warmest place played softly from her speaker. Mason leaned his bike against the crooked fence and handed her one of the bottles without saying much. Evelyn looked surprised again. "You came back," she said quietly. Mason shrugged as he wiped sweat from his forehead. "I figured somebody should help before you pass out in this heat." For the first time in years, laughter echoed inside the abandoned garden. It was small and brief, but people nearby noticed it. Frank Dalton noticed it most of all. His auto repair shop sat half a block away, and every afternoon he usually ate lunch alone beside the open garage door while listening to baseball games on a crackling radio. He had watched Evelyn from a distance all week, pretending not to care while secretly admiring the stubborn determination in her movements. That afternoon, he loaded several old wooden boards into the back of his pickup truck and drove slowly toward the garden. These were heading for the dump anyway, he muttered as he dropped the wood beside the broken benches. Evelyn brushed dirt from her gloves and smiled warmly. Looks to me like they still have life left in them. Frank spent the next 3 hours repairing the old seating area beneath a dying maple tree, while Mason helped tighten rusted screws using tools that were almost bigger than his hands. By sunset, 2 benches stood straight again for the first time in nearly a decade. Cars slowed as they passed. Some people stared. Others smiled without realizing it. A few days later, Sophie Lane arrived carrying paint cans splattered with bright colors. She had moved into town only a month earlier after leaving Chicago behind, hoping the quiet coastal town would help her recover from a difficult year she never liked talking about. She walked into the garden wearing oversized headphones around her neck and holding several handmade wooden signs under one arm. One sign read, "Take what you need." Another said, "Sunflowers ahead." Evelyn watched silently as Sophie planted the signs beside freshly watered flower beds. "This place needed color," Sophie explained softly. "People do too." Soon after that, Howard Green drove in from his farm outside town with packets of tomato seeds, cucumber plants, and sweet corn wrapped carefully in newspaper. Linda Foster brought marigolds and an old green watering hose from her garage. Nobody asked who was in charge. Nobody held meetings or made plans. Somehow, people simply started showing up. Every evening, the garden changed a little more. Weeds disappeared. Soil darkened beneath fresh water. Small green sprouts pushed through the earth beneath the summer sun. Children began stopping after school to help water plants using tiny plastic buckets. Elderly neighbors who had not spoken in years suddenly found themselves sitting together beneath the repaired benches discussing weather, recipes, and old memories from decades ago when Seabrook Cove still felt alive. The garden slowly became louder than the silence people had been carrying inside themselves for years. Gerald Pike still complained every chance he got. "People are acting like they discovered paradise in a pile of dirt," he grumbled while sweeping the sidewalk outside his grocery store. But even he started leaving cold bottled water near the garden fence every morning without telling anyone it came from him. Brenda Shaw continued insisting the excitement would fade by fall. Yet one afternoon, she quietly delivered a tray of fresh peach pies for everyone working under the heat. Evelyn noticed these things, but never pointed them out. She understood something most people forgot as they grew older. Sometimes kindness arrived disguised as pride. One evening near sunset, Evelyn sat alone beneath the maple tree after everyone else had gone home. The garden looked different now. Tiny rows of vegetables stretched across the soil like promises. Yellow flowers swayed gently beside the fence. Wind chimes Sophie had hung from a branch sang softly whenever the ocean breeze rolled through town. Evelyn lowered herself carefully onto the repaired bench and listened to the fading sound of children laughing somewhere down the street. Then the voice from her little speaker quietly said, "Loneliness does not always disappear when people arrive. Sometimes it disappears the moment somebody notices you stayed." Evelyn closed her eyes as tears gathered silently beneath her lashes. For years after her husband passed away, she had spent most evenings sitting alone inside a dark little house 3 miles from the shore, eating dinner beside an empty chair, while entire days passed without hearing her own voice. But now, somehow, this forgotten garden had started filling empty spaces she thought would remain hollow forever. And deep down, although she was afraid to admit it even to herself, she realized the garden was no longer the only thing slowly coming back to life. By the middle of August, people in Seabrook Cove had started changing their daily routines without even realizing it. Parents brought folding chairs to the garden after dinner instead of staying inside watching television. Teenagers who normally spent afternoons glued to their phones now helped Mason build small wooden planters beside the fence. Elderly neighbors who once kept their curtains closed throughout the day began stepping outside with coffee mugs in hand just to see what had changed overnight. Every corner of the garden carried signs of life now. Rows of tomatoes ripened beneath the sun. Tall sunflowers turned slowly toward the sky each morning. Mint leaves and lavender filled the warm air with soft, earthy scents that drifted through the nearby streets. Wind chimes clicked gently from tree branches, while painted rocks lined the walking path Sophie had created using old bricks people donated from their backyards. Nobody could remember the exact moment the garden stopped belonging to Evelyn and started belonging to everyone. It simply happened little by little, one conversation at a time. One evening, Frank brought an old projector screen from his garage and hung it between two maple trees. By sunset, dozens of people gathered on blankets and lawn chairs while children chased fireflies through the grass. Brenda Shaw surprised everyone by carrying trays of hamburgers and lemonade into the garden free of charge. Gerald Pike sat near the back pretending he was only there because he had nothing else to do, but Mason caught him smiling twice during the movie. Evelyn stayed mostly quiet that night, sitting near the flower beds with her hands folded gently in her lap, while soft laughter echoed around her. The lights from the projector flickered across faces that no longer looked so tired all the time. At one point, Sophie sat beside her holding a paper plate with half a slice of peach pie balanced carefully on her knee. "You know this town talks about you constantly now," she said with a small grin. Evelyn looked embarrassed. "That sounds dangerous." Sophie laughed softly before growing quiet again. "I think people forgot they needed each other," she admitted after a moment. "And somehow you reminded them." Evelyn stared toward the movie screen where children were lying on their stomachs in the grass, pointing at the stars overhead. For a long time she said nothing. Then she whispered, almost too softly to hear, "I was only trying to survive another lonely summer." Sophie glanced at her carefully, but did not press further. Most people in town still knew very little about Evelyn Harper. They knew she lived alone in a pale blue house near the edge of town. They knew she loved gardening and old radio stories. They knew she never missed a single morning in the garden, even when temperatures climbed above 90 degrees. But they did not know about the long winter after her husband died. They did not know about the months she spent barely speaking to anyone besides cashiers at grocery stores. They did not know her children lived hundreds of miles away with busy lives that seemed to grow farther from her every year. Evelyn never blamed them out loud. Still, there were evenings when the silence inside her house became so heavy she could barely breathe beneath it. Before the garden, entire weekends sometimes passed with no knocks at her door, no ringing phone, no reason to leave bed before noon. Her doctor once gently suggested therapy after she admitted she often forgot what day it was. The loneliness had not arrived all at once. It came slowly, quietly, like fog rolling in from the ocean. Then one sleepless night months earlier, while sitting alone in her kitchen listening to rain tap against the windows, Evelyn accidentally found The Warmest Place while scrolling through old podcasts on her phone. The episode was called "No One Eats Alone." She still remembered the exact sentence that made her stop crying long enough to listen. Sometimes healing begins the moment somebody realizes they still matter to another human being. Evelyn replayed those words 3 times that night, then again the next morning. A week later, she walked past the abandoned garden for the first time in years and noticed a single yellow flower, somehow blooming through cracked soil near the broken fence. That tiny flower stayed in her mind for days. And eventually, without fully understanding why, she returned carrying gardening gloves and a shovel. Back in the present, the summer movie ended beneath a sky full of stars while people slowly gathered trash, folded blankets, and carried sleepy children home. But many lingered longer than necessary, reluctant to leave the warmth surrounding the garden. As Evelyn quietly watered a row of sunflowers near closing time, she noticed Gerald Pike standing awkwardly near the gate with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "The tomatoes near the east side need better support beams," he muttered without looking directly at her. "Storm season starts soon." Then before she could answer, he placed several brand new wooden stakes beside the fence and walked away into the darkness. Evelyn smiled softly to herself as the wind carried the distant sound of ocean waves through the glowing garden. Even the hardest hearts in Seabrook Cove were beginning to bloom. September arrived quietly in Seabrook Cove, carrying cooler mornings and long golden evenings that painted the entire town in soft amber light. The garden had grown so full by then that people often slowed their cars just to admire it through open windows. Bright sunflowers towered over children racing between pathways. Pumpkin vines curled around handmade wooden fences. Strings of lanterns swayed above picnic tables Frank had built from reclaimed wood. Every evening, the scent of basil, fresh soil, and baked bread drifted through the neighborhood, while music floated gently beneath the trees. It no longer felt like an abandoned lot. It felt alive. One Saturday afternoon, Linda Foster suggested organizing a small harvest dinner inside the garden before summer officially ended. Nobody expected many people to come, but by sunset nearly the entire neighborhood had gathered beneath the glowing lights. Families carried casserole dishes wrapped in towels. Elderly couples brought homemade pies. Children ran around with paper crowns woven from flower stems, while Mason proudly showed everyone the pumpkins he had grown himself. Evelyn moved slowly between tables, helping refill lemonade pitchers while people called her name from every direction. Evelyn, come taste this peach cobbler. Evelyn, look at these tomatoes. Evelyn, you have to see what the kids painted. Each voice carried warmth she still was not fully used to hearing. For years, her name had mostly existed in silence. Now it echoed through the garden like part of the evening breeze. As darkness settled over Seabrook Cove, Sophie hung dozens of tiny glass lanterns from the maple trees while Frank adjusted speakers near the benches. Soft violin music soon filled the air as neighbors shared stories late into the evening. One older man admitted he had lived on the same street for 15 years without ever learning his neighbors' names until that summer. A young mother quietly confessed she had struggled with loneliness after moving to town and almost left before discovering the garden. Even Gerald Pike eventually wandered over carrying a tray of cornbread he insisted had come from a recipe nobody appreciated anymore. People laughed more easily now. The heavy distance that once lingered between neighbors seemed to dissolve beneath the lantern glow night after night. Evelyn watched it all from her usual bench beneath the maple tree. Sometimes she still found herself overwhelmed by the strange beauty of it. There had been a time not long ago when she believed her life was slowly shrinking into something small and forgettable. After her husband Thomas passed away. For years earlier, the world seemed to lose color one quiet piece at a time. The house became too silent. Meals became too quiet. Even mornings felt heavier without hearing another voice moving through the kitchen. Her children called when they could, but work schedules and long distances slowly turned conversations into rushed check-ins every few weeks. Evelyn never wanted them to feel guilty, so she always said she was doing fine. But most evenings, after hanging up the phone, she sat alone beside the living room lamp listening to the refrigerator hum through the empty house. Some nights, she drove to the grocery store just to walk near other people for a while. Other nights, she stayed in bed far longer than she should have, staring at the ceiling while hours slipped away unnoticed. Then somehow this garden changed everything. Not all at once. Slowly, like sunlight creeping across a dark room. It gave her somewhere to go before loneliness could catch up each morning. It gave her reasons to wake early, reasons to speak, reasons to laugh again. More than once, she found herself smiling while washing dirt from her hands at night simply because she could still hear echoes of children laughing in her memory. Late that evening during the harvest dinner, Mason climbed onto one of the benches holding a spoon against a lemonade jar to get everyone's attention. "We should do a real festival here," he announced proudly. "Like a big summer celebration every year." The crowd chuckled warmly while Sophie raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly would we call this festival?" Mason thought hard for a second before grinning. "The Sunshine Garden Festival." To Evelyn's surprise, applause erupted across the garden. Frank slapped the table approvingly. Linda immediately started discussing decorations. Brenda offered free lemonade for the event, while several teenagers volunteered to organize music and games. Even Gerald Pike muttered that he could donate extra produce from his store if people stopped overcooking everything. Evelyn sat very still as the excitement swirled around her. Above the garden, hundreds of tiny lantern lights shimmered against the dark September sky while neighbors laughed together like old friends reunited after years apart. And for the first time since losing Thomas, Evelyn felt something she thought had disappeared forever. She felt needed again. Preparations for the Sunshine Garden Festival quickly took over the entire town. By the second week of September, colorful sketches and handwritten plans covered nearly every picnic table in the garden. Sophie designed posters filled with bright watercolor flowers and hung them in coffee shops, grocery stores, and library windows across Seabrook Cove. Frank spent his evenings building a small wooden stage beneath the maple trees, while Mason and several neighborhood kids painted old mason jars to use as lanterns. Linda organized volunteers to prepare food tables, and Brenda surprised everyone by offering free lemonade and homemade peach cobbler for the festival night. Even people who had barely spoken to one another before summer now greeted each other warmly on sidewalks and outside stores. The town itself seemed lighter somehow, as if a long winter had finally ended even though autumn was quietly approaching. Every evening after work, families gathered in the garden to prepare decorations while soft music drifted through the cooling air. Children practiced a small dance performance near the sunflowers. A local violin teacher offered to organize live music beneath the lantern lights. Howard Green brought wagon loads of pumpkins and fresh vegetables from his farm, while elderly neighbors carefully braided ribbons around flower pots for the festival entrance. The garden no longer looked handmade in a rough or temporary way. It looked loved. One afternoon, Evelyn arrived carrying a box filled with old photographs she had found in her attic. Most of them showed Seabrook Cove decades earlier. Pictures of crowded summer parades, children eating ice cream on the boardwalk, neighbors dancing beneath paper lanterns during long-forgotten harvest festivals. People gathered around the photos quietly while passing them from hand to hand. "I remember this diner," Gerald Pike murmured softly while staring at a faded photograph from 1978. "My father used to bring me there after Little League games." Brenda leaned over his shoulder smiling. "That old jukebox broke every other week." Soon stories spread through the garden as naturally as laughter. Memories people had not shared in years suddenly returned beneath the soft September sunlight. Evelyn listened quietly while organizing photographs across one of the picnic tables. Moments like these still overwhelmed her sometimes. Not because they were grand or dramatic, but because they felt gentle in a way life had not felt for a very long time. There was comfort now in simple things. The sound of folding chairs scraping softly against dirt. The smell of coffee and cinnamon drifting through cool evening air. The sight of neighbors waving from across the garden as though they had known one another forever. One evening after most volunteers had gone home, Sophie stayed behind helping Evelyn hang lanterns along the fence. The sky glowed deep orange above the ocean while wind moved softly through the sunflowers. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie said carefully after a long silence. Evelyn nodded while untangling strands of lights. "Why this garden?" Sophie asked. "Out of every place in town, why did you choose here?" Evelyn paused for a moment. She looked across the garden where tiny lights already flickered beneath the trees. Then she smiled sadly. "Because it looked the way I felt." Sophie lowered the lantern in her hand slightly, but said nothing. Evelyn continued quietly. "After Thomas passed away, everything inside me became overgrown. Silence everywhere. Days blurred together. I stopped answering calls sometimes because pretending I was okay became exhausting. The wind carried the distant sound of waves toward them while lanterns swayed gently overhead. I thought loneliness would pass eventually," Evelyn admitted. "But it settles into you if you let it stay too long." Sophie listened carefully as Evelyn stared down at the dirt path beneath her feet. "The night I found that podcast episode about strangers sharing meals together, I realized something," Evelyn whispered. "Most lonely people are not asking for miracles. They just want to feel visible again." Tears gathered briefly in Sophie's eyes, before she smiled softly. "Well," she said gently, looking around the glowing garden, "I do not think anybody here could miss you now." Evelyn laughed quietly for the first time all day. But just as the evening settled into comfortable silence again, a black SUV slowly rolled to a stop across the street from the garden. The vehicle remained parked there for several minutes while a man in a dark gray suit stepped out, holding a clipboard beneath one arm. He studied the garden carefully from behind the fence, his expression unreadable beneath the fading sunset. Frank noticed him first while stacking lumber near the stage. Gerald noticed him next from inside the grocery store window. Nobody recognized the man, but something about his presence felt cold against the warmth surrounding the garden. After a few minutes, he returned to the SUV without speaking to anyone and drove away toward the beach highway. Evelyn watched the taillights disappear into the evening darkness, while a strange uneasiness settled quietly into her chest for reasons she could not yet explain. The following morning, the strange feeling from the night before still lingered over the garden like heavy coastal fog. People arrived early carrying folding tables, baskets of flowers, and boxes of decorations for the Sunshine Garden Festival, but conversations sounded quieter than usual. Several neighbors had also noticed the black SUV parked across the street the evening before, and rumors began moving gently through Seabrook Cove before noon. Frank tried to dismiss it while hammering together the final pieces of the festival stage. "Probably just somebody lost looking for the beach," he muttered, although his voice lacked confidence. Gerald Pike spent half the morning staring through the grocery store window toward the garden with a deep crease across his forehead. Even Mason sensed something had shifted. The boy rode his bicycle slower than usual that day, glancing repeatedly toward the road whenever cars passed by. Evelyn tried to focus on preparing flower arrangements beside the main walkway, but uneasiness tugged quietly at her thoughts. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, the black SUV returned. This time it did not remain parked across the street. It rolled slowly toward the garden entrance before stopping near the old wooden fence Frank had repaired weeks earlier. Conversations faded almost immediately. The man in the gray suit stepped out again, holding the same clipboard beneath one arm. Up close, he looked to be in his early 50s with silver-framed glasses and polished shoes that seemed strangely out of place beside the dirt pathways and flower beds. He studied the garden carefully before approaching Evelyn near the entrance. "Are you Evelyn Harper?" he asked politely. Evelyn nodded slowly while wiping soil from her gardening gloves. "My name is Victor Langford," the man said. "I represent Coastal Horizon Development Group." Several nearby volunteers stopped what they were doing. Frank straightened slowly from the stage platform while Sophie lowered a box of lanterns onto the grass. Victor offered a thin professional smile before continuing. "I am afraid I need to inform you that this property is scheduled for redevelopment beginning next week." Silence spread through the garden. Even the children stopped talking. Evelyn blinked slowly as if she had misunderstood him. "Redevelopment?" she repeated quietly. Victor opened his folder and removed several documents. "This land has been under long-term lease agreement with our company for over 6 years, he explained. Construction preparations for a parking facility connected to the new beachfront resort are scheduled to begin immediately following permit approval. Mason looked confused. "A parking lot?" he asked aloud. Victor adjusted his glasses slightly. "Additional guest parking for the resort, yes." Frank climbed down from the stage, his boots hitting the dirt heavily. "You cannot be serious," he said. "This place is the heart of the neighborhood now." Victor remained calm. "I understand emotions are involved," he replied carefully. "However, the legal agreements were finalized years ago before any unauthorized activity began on this property." The word unauthorized landed heavily in the air. Sophie crossed her arms tightly. "You mean before people brought this town back to life?" she snapped. Quietly, Victor glanced around at the lanterns, flowers, benches, and crowded garden beds. For the first time, something uncertain flickered briefly across his face, but it disappeared almost immediately beneath practiced professionalism. "Construction vehicles will arrive early next Friday," he continued. "We ask that personal items and temporary structures be removed before then." Then he handed Evelyn an envelope containing copies of permits and notices before stepping back toward his vehicle. Nobody spoke while the SUV disappeared down the street toward the beach highway. The entire garden suddenly felt different after that. The lanterns no longer looked magical beneath the afternoon sun. The flowers seemed fragile somehow. People stood frozen beside half-finished festival decorations while the reality slowly settled over them. Mason kicked at the dirt angrily before grabbing his bicycle and riding away without a word. Brenda quietly sat down on one of the benches looking pale. Gerald Pike stared toward the road with his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed painful. Frank eventually broke the silence first. "We are not letting them bulldoze this place," he muttered. But even his voice carried uncertainty now. Evelyn remained standing near the entrance holding the envelope against her chest. Her eyes moved slowly across the garden. Across the pumpkins Howard had grown. Across Sophie's painted signs. Across the maple tree wrapped in lanterns. Across the benches filled with memories from an entire summer. Just weeks earlier, this place had been forgotten by everyone. Now the thought of losing it hurt in a way she could barely explain. That evening, people still gathered in the garden, but the laughter sounded softer than before. Conversations drifted anxiously beneath the lantern lights while neighbors whispered about lawyers, permits, petitions, and town meetings. Evelyn sat quietly beneath the maple tree long after sunset, listening to the familiar voice from the warmest place play softly beside her. Sometimes, the storyteller said gently through the speaker, "The places that save us become the places worth fighting for." Evelyn lowered her head as tears filled her tired eyes, because deep down, for the first time in years, she finally understood what it felt like to belong somewhere again. And now she was terrified of losing it. The days leading up to Friday passed through Seabrook Cove with a strange heaviness hanging over everything. Even the ocean seemed quieter somehow. People still came to the garden every evening, but nobody moved with the same carefree energy anymore. Conversations turned into worried whispers beneath the lantern lights, while unfinished festival decorations sat untouched beside the pathways. The cheerful excitement that once filled the garden had been replaced by uncertainty none of them knew how to fight. Every morning, Evelyn still arrived before sunrise carrying her old gardening cart and portable speaker, but now she often stood silently at the entrance for several seconds before walking in, as though trying to prepare herself for the possibility that each day might be the last. The garden itself looked more beautiful than ever. That almost made it harder. Sunflowers stretched high above the fences, glowing gold beneath the autumn sunlight. Pumpkins rested beside rows of kale and tomatoes. Sophie's painted signs swayed gently in the breeze while tiny lanterns waited silently for the festival that suddenly felt impossible. One afternoon, Mason sat cross-legged beside the flower beds, twisting blades of grass nervously between his fingers. "What happens if they tear it all down?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered him at first. Frank stared toward the half-finished stage while tightening bolts that no longer seemed important. Linda lowered her watering can slowly onto the dirt path. Even Gerald Pike avoided looking at the boy. Finally, Evelyn knelt beside him carefully, her knees stiff against the ground. "Then we remember what happened here," she whispered softly. Mason shook his head. "That is not enough." His voice cracked slightly before he looked away toward the road. Evelyn felt her chest tighten painfully because deep down she knew he was right. This place had become more than flowers and benches and lanterns. It had become proof that lonely people could still find one another again. Losing it now felt like watching hope slowly slip backward into silence. That evening, a town meeting was held inside the small community center near the marina. Nearly every chair was filled. Families crowded against walls while people argued quietly over possible solutions. Some wanted lawyers. Others suggested fundraising to buy the land. A few insisted nothing could stop the construction because the paperwork was already finalized. The tension inside the room grew heavier with every passing minute. Victor Langford attended briefly with two representatives from Coastal Horizon Development Group. He remained polite while explaining the economic benefits the resort expansion would supposedly bring to Seabrook Cove. Additional tourism, increased revenue, more business opportunities. But each carefully rehearsed sentence only made the room colder. Finally, Brenda Shaw stood up from the back row with tears shining in her eyes. "That garden saved people this summer," she said quietly. "Maybe not financially, but emotionally." The room fell silent. Frank slowly nodded beside her. Then another voice spoke up, and another after that. Elderly neighbors admitted the garden had given them companionship after years of isolation. Parents talked about children who suddenly spent less time staring at screens and more time outdoors laughing together. Sophie described how strangers who once ignored each other now shared meals beneath the lanterns every week. Gerald Pike cleared his throat awkwardly before muttering. People started acting like neighbors again. Even Victor seemed briefly unsettled by the emotion filling the room. But when the meeting ended, no solution had been reached. Construction was still scheduled for Friday morning. That night, Evelyn returned to the garden alone long after everyone else had gone home. Cool wind rustled softly through the sunflowers while lantern lights flickered gently overhead. She walked slowly along each pathway, touching leaves, benches, and fence posts as though saying goodbye to old friends. The garden smelled of fresh soil and late autumn flowers. Somewhere in the distance, waves crashed softly against the shore beneath the dark sky. Evelyn eventually lowered herself onto the bench beneath the maple tree where she had spent so many evenings listening to stories from the warmest place. She pressed play on her old speaker with trembling fingers. The familiar voice drifted quietly into the empty garden. Sometimes the loneliest people become the ones who remind everyone else how to love each other again. Evelyn covered her face as tears finally slipped freely through her fingers. For months, she had tried to stay strong for everyone else. But now exhaustion settled heavily into her bones. She thought about returning home to the silent little house that no longer felt quite as empty because of this place. She thought about all the mornings Mason rode his bicycle through the gates, about Frank fixing benches beneath the heat, about Sophie painting signs while music played through the trees, about elderly neighbors sitting together beneath lantern lights, sharing stories they thought nobody cared to hear anymore. And for the first time since the bulldozer announcement, Evelyn allowed herself to admit how deeply afraid she truly was. Because losing the garden no longer felt like losing a project. It felt like losing a family. Nobody in Seabrook Cove slept much the night before the construction was scheduled to begin. Porch lights stayed on long past midnight, while worried conversations drifted through open windows across town. Some people sat quietly at kitchen tables, staring into untouched cups of coffee. Others walked down to the garden one last time, carrying folding chairs and blankets, as though gathering beside the bedside of someone they loved. By 2 o'clock in the morning, soft lantern lights still glowed beneath the maple trees, while small groups of neighbors sat together in silence, listening to the wind move through the flowers. Evelyn remained on the old wooden bench near the center path, wrapped in a cardigan against the cool ocean breeze. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that reached deeper than sleep. Mason sat beside her with his bicycle laid across the grass nearby, while Frank and Sophie quietly checked social media updates on their phones. Earlier that evening, Sophie had uploaded a short video showing the transformation of the garden over the summer. The video began with old footage of the abandoned lot filled with weeds and broken benches before shifting into scenes of children planting flowers, neighbors sharing meals beneath lanterns, and elderly residents laughing together under the maple trees. At the very end, the video simply showed Evelyn watering sunflowers at sunrise while a sentence appeared across the screen. Some places grow more than flowers. Nobody expected much from the post at first, but overnight, something unexpected happened. Thousands of people began sharing the video across social media. Comments poured in from strangers all over the country. Former residents of Seabrook Cove reposted childhood memories connected to the old neighborhood. Local reporters contacted Sophie asking questions about the garden and the planned demolition. By sunrise, several regional news stations had picked up the story. Frank stared down at his phone in disbelief shortly after dawn. "You need to see this," he muttered. He turned the screen toward Evelyn. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched clip after clip of strangers sharing support for the garden. One video showed a teacher explaining how her students had started their own school garden after seeing Sophie's post. Another came from an elderly widower in Oregon who admitted he had not left his house in weeks until watching footage from Seabrook Cove reminded him what community could feel like. Evelyn covered her mouth quietly while tears filled her eyes again. "I do not understand," she whispered softly. "Why do all these people care?" Sophie smiled gently beside her. "Because lonely people recognize hope when they see it." By 8 o'clock that morning, hundreds of people had gathered inside and outside the garden. Some carried handmade signs covered in painted flowers and messages about community. Others brought food, folding tables, lanterns, and speakers. Instead of canceling the Sunshine Garden Festival, the town transformed it into something even bigger. Music drifted through the streets while neighbors hung every remaining lantern across the trees and fences. Children handed out ribbons and sunflowers to arriving visitors. Brenda served free lemonade beside tables overflowing with homemade pies and sandwiches. Elderly residents shared stories with reporters beneath the maple tree, while cameras captured scenes of neighbors embracing each other beside rows of blooming flowers. The atmosphere felt emotional, but strangely beautiful too. Like people had finally realized how precious the garden truly was only when faced with losing it. Shortly after 9 o'clock, the bulldozers arrived. Their engines rumbled softly as they rolled toward the entrance, while construction workers stepped out looking uncertain beneath the growing crowd. But instead of anger or shouting, they were met with music. A local violinist stood near the garden gate, playing softly beneath strands of glowing lanterns, while children sat painting flower pots along the pathways. Families gathered together, eating breakfast on picnic blankets beside the pumpkins and sunflowers. The entire garden felt alive in a way no blueprint or parking lot could ever measure. Victor Langford arrived moments later, looking visibly stunned by the size of the crowd. Television cameras immediately surrounded him, while reporters questioned him about demolishing a beloved community space that had gone viral overnight. Gerald Pike, who once mocked the entire project, stepped forward carrying one of Sophie's handmade signs. "This place matters," he said firmly into a reporter's microphone. "Not because it makes money, because it made people human again." Nearby, Mason stood beside Evelyn, holding her hand tightly as tears rolled down her cheeks while she looked around at the enormous crowd filling every corner of the garden. Elderly couples danced slowly beneath the lanterns. Children laughed beside the flower beds. Strangers hugged each other like lifelong friends. The entire town had shown up. And for the first time since the terrible announcement days earlier, Evelyn felt something fragile but powerful returning inside her chest. Hope. The crowd remained inside the garden for hours after the bulldozers arrived. Nobody wanted to leave. Reporters moved carefully through the flower paths, interviewing families, while television cameras captured children hanging fresh lanterns beside rows of sunflowers glowing beneath the late morning light. Music drifted gently through the garden as though the entire town had silently agreed that if this truly became the final day, they would fill every last moment with warmth instead of anger. Evelyn sat quietly beneath the maple tree, surrounded by neighbors who only months earlier had barely known each other existed. Mason stayed close beside her while Sophie helped organize interviews with local news crews. Frank handed bottled water to volunteers, moving tables and chairs farther away from the construction entrance, just in case. Even Gerald Pike walked through the crowd, shaking hands awkwardly with people he had ignored for years. Something inside Seabrook Cove had changed too deeply to return to what it once was. Around noon, Victor Langford stepped away from the reporters and made a phone call near the edge of the parking lot. His expression looked tighter now than it had the day he first arrived with paperwork in hand. Across social media, the story of the garden continued spreading faster every hour. Videos of neighbors dancing beneath lanterns and children watering flowers filled news feeds across the country. One clip showing Evelyn quietly crying beside the sunflowers while townspeople gathered around her reached hundreds of thousands of views before lunchtime. Strangers began arriving from nearby towns carrying flowers, homemade signs, and donations. Some simply came to stand quietly inside the garden because they said the story reminded them of places and people they had lost in their own lives. By early afternoon, several local officials arrived unexpectedly at the garden entrance. Tension spread through the crowd at first, but then whispers quickly moved from person to person as news traveled beneath the lanterns. The city council had called an emergency review meeting after overwhelming public pressure and regional media attention. Construction permits were being temporarily suspended pending re-evaluation of the land's community use designation. For a moment, nobody reacted. The words almost felt too impossible to understand. Then Mason shouted first. "Does that mean they cannot tear it down?" One of the officials nodded carefully. "Not today." Cheers erupted across the garden so suddenly that several birds scattered upward from the maple trees. People hugged each other while tears streamed freely down smiling faces. Brenda cried openly behind her lemonade stand. Frank wrapped one arm around Gerald Pike, who pretended to complain while wiping his eyes. Sophie collapsed onto one of the benches, laughing breathlessly with relief. Evelyn remained frozen beneath the tree as if her heart needed extra time to believe what she had just heard. But the biggest surprise came later that evening. After hours of closed meetings with city officials and growing national attention surrounding the story, Coastal Horizon Development Group officially announced they would withdraw the parking lot project entirely. The company agreed to release the lease rights and support preserving the property as an official public community garden managed by the town of Seabrook Cove. When the announcement spread through the crowd shortly after sunset, the entire garden seemed to exhale at once. Lanterns flickered softly above hundreds of smiling faces, while music rose warmly into the cooling night air. The Sunshine Garden Festival continued exactly as planned that evening. Only now it felt bigger than any festival people could remember. Children danced beneath glowing lights, while violin music floated gently through rows of flowers and pumpkins. Elderly neighbors sat together sharing stories beneath blankets. Families filled long picnic tables with homemade food, while strangers laughed together like old friends reunited after years apart. Above it all, lanterns shimmered against the dark coastal sky like tiny stars hanging just above the garden paths. Near midnight, Evelyn slowly stood near the center of the garden while people gathered around her quietly. She looked across the faces surrounding her. Faces that no longer felt unfamiliar. Faces that had become part of her life in ways she never expected during those lonely nights months earlier. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. I thought I came here to plant flowers because I did not know what else to do with my loneliness. Tears filled her eyes while lantern light reflected softly against them. But somewhere along the way, all of you planted something too. Silence settled gently across the garden as people listened. Evelyn looked toward Mason laughing beside the pumpkin tables, toward Frank fixing one final lantern near the stage, toward Sophie smiling beneath the maple tree while music drifted softly through the warm autumn night. This place did not save just me, Evelyn whispered. It reminded all of us that we still belong to each other. Later that night, long after the music faded and most festival lights dimmed, small groups of neighbors remained sitting together beneath the lanterns talking quietly beneath the stars. Evelyn sat once more on the old wooden bench beside her tiny speaker while voices from the warmest place drifted softly into the cool ocean air. Around her, Seabrook Cove no longer felt like a town full of strangers. It felt like home.